pluralism and integrationism, and is concerned that the BPS model, which is synonymous with eclecticism, has become the mainstream today. Pluralism and integrationism are ideas that might overcome such fears, of which pluralism is not new and can be traced back to Jaspers. According to Gummy, most psychiatrists are proponents of either psychotherapy or psychiatric medication, but because they rarely ask what they are doing or why they are doing it that way, in their practice, they have become dogmatists. The word dogmatist here means that these clinicians take a monistic approach to psychiatry. In response to such criticism, most psychiatrists do not admit that they are dogmatists, but rather emphasize that they are eclecticists. The eclecticists here are basically those who do not have a single point of view on what can best explain psychiatry. And today, most eclecticists have adopted by BPS model. The BPS model, systematically developed by Engel in the 1970s, was seen by many in the psychiatric profession as an alternative to biomedical reductionism. At a time when biological psychiatry was making a comeback and the influence of psychoanalysts was waning. On the other hand, those of the biological school were also hesitant to clarify biological etiology for psychiatric disorders, even though the DSM-3 published in 1980 promoted a return to Kraepelin's classification of diseases. It is precisely because of this station that the BPS model, which is consistent with all approaches, was accepted. The strength of the BPS model lies in its elimination of dogmatism, but according to Gummy, the disadvantage of degenerating into lazy eclecticism outweighs such strengths. Is because the BPS model explains all illnesses as having multiple components, biological, psychological, and social, and does nothing more than assert this. Yet another problem is that this model confuses cause with cure. As a result, all psychiatric illnesses are considered biological, psychological, and social, and all patients must receive both biological and psychosocial treatment. Is there then any valid alternative to dogmatism and eclecticism? In the early 1970s, Havens criticized dogmatism and eclecticism and presented pluralism as an alternative to them. He organized the various approaches in psychiatry into four schools: objective and descriptive, psychoanalytic, existential, and interpersonal, which are classified according to method rather than content. The objective and descriptive school is based on the traditional scientific method based on objective observation and statistical analysis, and its representative is Kraepelin. In this school, a list of symptoms and signs is obtained by psychiatric history taking and psychiatric symptom assessment, and the disease behind this syndrome is identified. The discovered disease is then treated physically as any other medical disease. The psychoanalytic school was founded by Freud, and numerous branches have since developed, but the basic method common to all branches is free association. In all branches, the method of proceeding is that the physician or healer does not ask for a description of signs and symptoms, but first listen to the patient's words from a neutral standpoint. The primary method of the existential school is empathy. In this school, too, the healer begins by listening to what the patient states from a neutral standpoint. However, in this school, theorizing and organizing what is known is not done as in psychoanalysis. The role of the therapist is to understand the patient. The existential school has three main genealogies depending on the difference in their philosophical goods. The first lineage is that of Husserl, which has its foundation in Husserl and emphasizes phenomenological reduction. Jaspers was also under this tradition. The second lineage, based on early Heidegger, is a stream that emphasizes the existential structure of the individual's world. This lineage is represented by Winslow. The third genealogical stream is based on the late Heidegger, and its central theme is to consider the significance of the concept of originality in human understanding. Closely associated with this trend are Sartor, Lane, and Fromm. The interpersonal school, also called the social psychiatric school, was founded by Sullivan. Fromm, Erikson, and Gilligan are among its supporters. The methodology of the school of thought is to reveal the place of interpersonal relationships. This school of thought derives its methodology from Sullivan's idea that interpersonal friction occurs in any two-party relationship and that this affects the psychological phenomena observed. Another root of pluralism is McHugh and Slavny's book, The Perspectives of Psychiatry. They too articulated for theoretical distinct perspectives in psychiatry based on difference in basic approaches, illness, dimensions, behavior, and life story. Thus, a common treated running through the pluralist position is that there are multiple independent ways to understand and treat mental illness. And since each method is partial and has its limitations, it is avoided that any one method is considered absolute. Unlike eclecticism, it is also believed that if each method is to be used, each should be used alone. Although Jaspers' general psychopathology has been influential in German psychiatry for a century, it has not had the same impact in other countries as it has in Germany. Perhaps one of the factors was that the style of the work was quite different from that of a typical psychiatric text. In this regard, psychiatrist Shepard has also stated, this work should be regarded as a blueprint of knowledge. It is a guide to the many different but interrelated domains of knowledge. Jaspers himself considered this book a book to help us understand the conceptual foundation of what we do in psychiatry. Jaspers also wrote the following about the nature and goals of this work. The task of the general psychopathology is not to accumulate the individual findings to date, but to give them context. What is to be accomplished is to clarify, systematize, and give form to things. In other words, our knowledge of the basic facts and the vast array of methods used must be clear. We must then systematize that knowledge into comprehensive forms and finally give them shape to enrich man's ability to understand himself. What Jaspers attempted to do was to distinguish between different methods, perspectives, and approaches, and to demonstrate the diversity of psychopathological research by clarifying the differences among the various methods, perspectives, and approaches. He tried to grasp the different perspectives and to give each perspective its proper place through methodological awareness that would clarify the significance and limitations of each perspective. As Jaspers points out, only by way of method do we acquire facts, and since we always use some method to acquire the facts, it would be difficult to draw a clear line between fact and method. Thus, a classification based on the method used is also a classification about the fact of what it is for us. The above attempt to systematize psychiatric knowledge based on methodological awareness, as presented by Jaspers in his general psychopathology, is the origin of pluralism. The belief that each method is always partially valid and has its own limitations. Next, let us see how the system of knowledge of psychiatry based on methodological awareness is specifically developed in the general psychopathology. Second, man as a whole and diagnosis scheme. Jaspers describes the difficulty to systematizing knowledge about psychiatry as follows. There are only the various stages and subtypes of a single psychosis that exist, or are there multiple disease units from which we can draw a line? So far, the answer to that question is neither of the two. It also expresses the following. Complex disease units are like an endless, unraveling fabric. The shape of an individual disease is not like a plant that can be classified within a specimen. To be more precise, what the plant is in the first place, what the disease is itself uncertain in many ways. So what do we diagnose? According to Jaspers, to diagnose is to characterize comprehensively the whole of the morbid event that has struck a person as a certain unit, independent of other units. But no matter how we try to outline the whole picture of mental disorder, we realize that it will not work. He also points out that we can only make a tentative classification at best, that different researchers will come up with very different pictures because there are so many different possibilities for diagnosis, and that classification is always subject to theoretical contradictions and cannot always be consistent with the facts. The classification is always subject to theoretical contradictions, and it is impossible for it to always match the facts. Nevertheless, Jaspers lists 3 reasons why these empty attempts should continue. First, we want to see what we get when we look at the whole picture of mental disorders as they appear in practice in terms of disease units. Secondly, because some classification of mental disorders is necessary for convenience when describing something about each theory of psychiatry. Third, because classification is necessary to conduct statistical studies on large numbers of cases. In other words, even if it is impossible to draw an absolutely correct diagnostic scheme, it is essential for psychiatric research to proceed. The overview of the big picture mentioned first here is also an essential perspective for capturing man as a whole, which will be discussed later. The ideal scheme that Jaspers came up with after this explanation is a scheme in which only one place is given to a particular case and one place is given to every case. In addition, these individual types of disease exclude and conflict with each other in each case, achieving a disease unit philosophy. In practice, however, this is not the case, so while considering the ideal scheme, we have made the following changes. Simple blood baselines must be clearly presented. He added, as for the detailed classification, it must be carried out according to its importance for the overall picture. Of course, there may be cases in which we must abandon the idea of disease units and record anew the various perspectives, or we may be forced to conveniently draw boundaries that are there in the face of various facts. Thus, such clarification of value only provisional. In other words, the classification of disease in psychiatry is for the time being one fiction that can perform its function insofar as it is relatively optimal. After making these works, Jaspers proposed a classification of disease very similar to the DSM-3. According to it, psychiatric conditions are classified into three main groups. The first group is non-physical diseases with mental disorders, and this group is further divided into three categories: brain disease, physical disease with symptomatic mental disorders, and addiction. Brain disease include brain injury, brain tumors, acute infections, chronic infections, vascular disease, hereditary system atrophy, and age-related organic disorders. The physical illness associated with symptomatic mental illnesses include infectious disease, endocrine disorders, and uremia. Addiction includes alcoholism, morphine, cocaine, and other drug addiction, and carbon monoxide poisoning. These first groupings are consistent with Axis 3 of the DSM-3, which describes psychiatric conditions secondary to non-physical medical illnesses. According to Jaspers, true diagnostics is possible only in the first group. Next, in the second group, three major psychoses are listed: bona fide epilepsy, schizophrenia, and manic depression. In this regard, it corresponds to Axis 1 of the DSM-3, that is the primary mode and psychotic disorders among the primary psychiatric conditions. And since that third group is personality disorders, it corresponds to Axis 2, which is also defined as personality disorders in the DSM-3. The background for presenting such a diagnostic scheme is Jaspers' view that man as a whole is never an object of recognition. Any perception of man is not conclusive because it is only a perception from a limited and partial perspective, and therefore, while it may show one aspect of human reality, it cannot show the totality of human reality. Therefore, it is preconceived notion that we can overview the human being as an object and make it the object of research recognition. That is why Jaspers developed the position of pluralism, which presents a diagnostic scheme that can perform its function insofar as it is relatively optimal and chooses the best method for the partiality of the symptoms. Third, existential communication and psychotherapy. As we have seen, Jaspers' general psychopathology calls attention to the uniqueness and difficulties of psychiatry and articulates a methodology for psychiatry based on methodological awareness. What then is the actual state of psychiatric care derived from the general psychopathology? In describing the characteristics of ideal psychotherapy, Jaspers argues that effective medical practice is, after all, based on unequivocal recognition. According to his argument, central to all psychotherapy is the doctor-patient relationship, and the ultimate in the relationship between the two is existential communication. And when this is realized, any treatment is taken into the community formed by the two subjects who are rational beings living as possible existences. The physician and the patient become one person and a companion to each other, sharing the same destiny. In doing so, the physician is neither a mere technician nor an authority figure, but merely an entity to existence, a shifting human being who is with others as well as with patients. However, only such physicians can use their professional powers to observe the man as a whole and come up with a treatment plan that consider the patient's social situation, environment, destiny, experiences, etc. The decisive event that such treatment ultimately brings about in the patient is disclosure, in which the patient clearly knows himself. Therefore, the meaning of healing differs fundamentally depending on whether the physician focuses on the patient's self-existence, attempts to advance the process of clarification through all stages, and works as a partner for self-disclosure in existential communication with the patient, or whether the physician uses natural science methods, either physical or psychological, to direct the healing effort towards the mechanism of the disease. In other words, the most contrasting polarity in treatment is whether the physician focuses on biological phenomena that can be explored by natural science or on human freedom. This distinction is intrinsic and not a matter of simple preference. In the presence of biological disease, there is no place for existential empathy for human freedom, and vice versa. Therefore, the physician must know which method to use and when to use it, as well as how to use each method. In other words, if there is a biological disease, it should be treated with drugs. But if the focus should be on human freedom, we must move together toward existential communication. Jaspers describes the difference as follows. I can cure life, but I can only call on you about freedom. So, what are the characteristics of an ideal psychotherapist? Jaspers lists a somatic medical background and a psychopathological background as essential for psychotherapists, both of which he sees as scientific, but he also notes that such a background alone does not yet make one a psychotherapist, and that science is only one of the auxiliary means. He then goes on to list the conditions that a psychotherapist should have as a person. According to this, What is important for the time being is the ability to keep one's distance from any value system as necessary without preconceived notions. And this is something that can only be achieved if one has methodological awareness. He also speaks of the need for warmth and compassion in the final stage, which may be a manifestation of a humanist consciousness capable of accepting the patient as a man as a whole. Conclusion. If Jaspers were a psychiatrist today, what would he practice? Perhaps for illnesses such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, he would adopt the biological reductionist model and apply it when appropriated with methodological awareness. But for the patient, a man as a whole with an illness, he would always try to achieve existential communication. The root of this humanistic consciousness in Jasper's psychiatry can be found in his existential philosophy, which Gami calls biological existentialism. The biological existentialism, unlike social constructionism and postmodernism, does not have an anti-medical perspective. In medicine in general and psychiatry in particular, phenomenology and existentialism have often been misunderstood as anti-scientific and non-biological ideas. Both medicine in general and psychiatry in particular should be biological as they deal with disease of the body, but they also need to be existential. This is because it involves the individual personality, whether the patient is suffering from a disease or has a life problem. These biological and existential viewpoints are not at odds with each other. The result of scientific research in psychology and the social science alone are not sufficient to provide a humanistic and existential orientation to individual human needs, values, and desires, while maintaining the standard scientific model of biomedicine. This is because man as a whole is a complex entity that cannot be fully grasped by such scientific research methods alone. As Jaspers himself stated, when the object of study is man and not man as a kind of animal, psychopathology is not by its very nature a form of biology, but rather a mental science. Science is sometimes equated with natural science, but this is a mistake. The scientific attitude which attempts to accommodate any method requires only the following universal criteria, that is universal validity, cogent insights, clarity of method, and the possibility of meaningful debate. The question may arise as to whether the various criteria of scientific attitude enumerated here would exclude understanding. Certainly, the process of understanding is different to be universally valid and cannot be proven in the same sense as the empirical method. Jaspers also seemed to think that understanding was less reliable in terms of empirical scientific validity when compared to explanation. But just because it was, he didn't consider the understanding to be an unscientific method. When discussing science, Jaspers uses the German word Wissenschaft, which directs all ordinary and organized inquiry, not just the natural sciences. Erich, the English translator of Jaspers' work, also commented that the core lies in what Jaspers called methodological awareness as follows. This does not only mean methodological practices and procedures. The term methodological awareness refers to a methodology that involve a conscious awareness of a series of things, such as how the method differs from other methods, why the method was chosen, why the method is important to the subject of the research, what are the methods for testing, what is the experience, and what are the results that the method produces. This view of the method of science presented by Jaspers may be acceptable to the type of psychotherapist who believe that there is no need for evidence in psychiatry, as well as to the type of neuroscientists who seek to promote quantification and objectivity in psychiatry. But just because we recognize biological factors for a given mental illness and accept the idea that social and psychological factors further influence such biological factors does not mean that we must be biological reductionists. On the other hand, even if one recognizes that the pathology of the psyche that do not have biological causes are purely socially constructed, this does not mean that one must be a cultural reductionist. However, the BPS model has attempted to overcome the two dogmatisms of biology and psychoanalysis by overcoming their problems, but it has yet to reach a final solution. In this chaotic state of psychiatry, the former ideological dominance of psychoanalysts has been supplanted by the DSM. Beyond the caress of the eclecticism promoted by the BPS model, we are already seeing signs of a resurgence of dogmatism in the form of DSM-based psychiatric manualization. And there is growing concern and apprehension about the manualization and simplification of psychiatry. It is impossible for psychiatry, which is manualized and simplified without methodological awareness and lacking existential communication, to grasp the patient as a man as a whole. This is not to say that the DSM should be rejected outright, but there is a need for methodological awareness of the possible significance and validity of these diagnostic criteria in psychiatry. Should we not learn again from Jaspers' general psychopathology about its necessity and importance? Thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, thanks, Professor Matsumaru, for introducing us in this session with this informative speech. And yes, we can open the Q&A session. And for the ones who weren't present yesterday, please introduce briefly yourselves before your question. Yes, we have some time for the Q&A. So.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for interesting lecture. The existential communication plays a role also in the psychotherapy. You said you talked about, and this is not question, but so. To everybody here, please explain the existential communication more precisely or more in detail. what is existential communication in Jaspers psychotherapy? That is my question.
Thank you for your question. Existential communication in psychiatry, psychotherapy is the same of existential communication in with us impossible in our life. But in modern psychiatry, a doctor and a patient aren't in relation, isn't the relation of existential communication, but or most of them patients are treatment of drugs or very short conversation of in the hospital. So yes, first, the relationship of doctor and patient will be a company of existential communication too. He hoped so, and I hope so. And my idea is that in the doctor school of university, students must learn existential communication of doctor and patient. We hope so.
What is the main characteristic of existential philosophy communication in Jaspers? That is clear to the Jaspers researchers, but to other people here, participants, what is the Merkmal or main characteristic of existential communication? One is loving struggle, liebender Kampf, and as you say, open Barbarian, and I think equality of niveau, Jaspers said in existential help. So, but existential communication needs such equality of niveau. But in the relationship between doctor and patients, it is in a sense an inequality of imbalance of not those title translation. The doctor is superior position, and patient is Gegenteil. And how can existential communication realize in the cases of psychotherapy in practice? That is my.
Perhaps yes, person, a doctor and the patient is equal as a human being.
As a human being. Among as a whole,
Among as a whole, yes, I think so.
We have a question by Professor Raquel online, if you can show it. She has some problems with connection, so she cannot make the question directly, but I can read it. If you show the chat. So yeah, Professor Raquel says, thank you for your very clear and interesting talk. It is really very interesting, the emphasis you put on the methodological question. But as you said, Jaspers, with respect to schizophrenia, would follow the biological method. And this has led some psychiatrists to accuse him of therapeutic nihilism. What is your opinion on this point? So she asks. Yeah, yeah, it's quite small.
Thank you for your question. But I'm afraid no off the top of my head, but I will find out.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay. So, Professor Harden.
I had a question in mind when I read your paper last night. Jaspers, in his critiques of Freud and Jung and Freud and all those people, he says that psychology can, psychoanalysis, but psychology cannot be used as a tool for understanding cultural history. So he's very clear about that. And the reason he says is that meanings, which you can gather from history or from the dreams of individual patients in that case too, that meanings do not equal causes. They can never, a meaning can never become a cause for anything. It's just a meaning, interpretation. But in his philosophy, the interpretation of ciphers, the meaning of ciphers is extremely important. The ciphers of transcendence. And in fact, that's the business of philosophical faith, is to interpret ciphers. So my question is, how do we distinguish a religious myth or symbol or a cipher from a psychological illness? How do we know if it's a cipher or a symptom? How would he interpret the psychological illness? I mean, William James, he just said it's fine, all religion is neurotic. So he, you know, he saw that the two are really indistinguishable, simply on the basis of religion, and he looked at the consequences in life, the fruits of your action. There's none of that in there's no morality to be, no ethic to begin with, but there's none of that in Jaspers. So how would he distinguish a cipher from a symptom?
Thank you for your comment. Jaspers couldn't the existence in his general psychopathology, so he has moved to philosophy. So, but general psychopathology is written by him after he went to study in philosophy. So we can read his general psychopathology. Now I can Jaspers transcending existence after his life, in his life, later life. So in first stage of his work isn't we couldn't understand the book in first stage out of that problem. I think.
So within the context of the general psychopathology, you cannot answer that question. I understand that. Okay.
I think the clue is Jasper's book about Strindberg and Van Gogh. Van Gogh. Yeah, Van Gogh is Jasper's interpret the Van Gogh as existential person, is he is a schizophrenic, but Jaspers can read a cipher of Van Gogh, but Swedenborg and Strindberg, he regards Strindberg nor as mad people, mad person.
Yes.
That is a distinction to be between two, I think.
What is the criteria that makes Van Gogh interpreted as a cipher of transcendence and Strindberg and Swedenborg as lunatics?
It is very difficult, but in English, authenticity, Wahrhaftigkeit, auf Deutsch. So meine.
If I can say something about this, because I wrote an article about it probably a few years ago. Jaspers tried to study these cases. Of course, he couldn't meet in person Strindberg or Van Gogh. So he did, the first important thing that he did is not reading text about them, but directly their letters, their diaries, in order to understand, to have some hints about their way of thinking, but directly with some first-hand proofs, not second-hand proofs. And what he noted is that the first thing that he noted is that they weren't crazy or lunatic, because in some moments they had some very clear ideas, especially Van Gogh. In the case of Strindberg, it's a bit different, but in the case of Van Gogh, with whom Jaspers familiarized even more, I would say, it's quite evident. They had some clear ideas in some moments. In other moments, their creativity was so powerful and strong that such creativity was somehow detaching them from reality. So they were losing connection with reality. So basically, their fantasy was working too much on the ciphers. So glimpsing ciphers, it's essential. But as we were saying yesterday, then you have to come back to the real world. And as I will say in half an hour, there must be a proof of existence. This would be Jeanne, but Jaspers would agree. There must be something concrete. Your reading of ciphers must find a place in the world, in the concrete natural world. We can say in the shared world, the intersubjective world. And in Van Gogh, Strindberg cases, many times it wasn't like this. They were just living in their fantasies. This is the distinction between some mental problem and an healthy, I would say, a healthy way of reading ciphers.
Because if I remember, I understand that there's a distinction between his later philosophical work and the general psychopathology, but in the general psychopathology, he's against the analysis of historical figures very clearly. He rejects that. So later he changes his opinion that you can read their letters and analyze them. That's surprising.
I think it's yet another way to, how can I say, to bring forth his intention in allgemeine psychopathology. So don't just study the patient, study the person behind the patient.
Okay.
This is what he wanted to do, reading the diaries. I mean, the diaries is the most personal thing you can read. So I think we should read it in this way, but I mean, online there are people who are way more acquainted than me about this topic, so I think. But yeah. Maybe I am right. I don't know. I don't know how to interpret. But yeah, I think we are fine. So yeah, we can thank Professor Matsumaru for answering also to the Q&A session. Oh yeah.